I'm Harrison Kelly with BYU-Idaho Radio, and I've got on the phone with me David Hokema. He's a hydrologist at the Idaho Department of Water Resources. We're going to talk a little bit about the current water situation here in the state of Idaho. David, thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. It's good to join you.
Glad to have you here. And I know that if you live in Idaho, you definitely are aware of it's been a drier year, a lot warmer temperatures throughout the winter and throughout the summer. And there's a lot of, in years previous, there's been a lot of struggles with water rights and all that. And so this is all kind of coming to a head. And this is kind of what I want to talk to you about. So how does this year's snowpack, the spring runoff, how does that compare to historical averages?
If we look at the NRCS SNOTEL network, we look like we're probably in the second, third driest snowpack on record. However, that's probably deceptive because it was so warm this winter. It pushed the snowpack up higher, and when we're comparing years, most of those years have a pretty normal snowpack distribution. But because the snowpack was pushed higher, it's really not a good comparison when you look at that index. And so it is possible we had the lowest snowpack on record. We just don't have the ability to measure it in a distributed fashion that would prove whether or not that's the case. But yeah, it was a really bad snowpack this year, despite the fact we had normal precipitation. And that's really hard for people to understand, but the precip came in, but it only snowed in the higher elevations, and we got rain in the lower elevations. In a dry area like southern Idaho, a lot of that rain ends up down in the soil, and doesn't make it into the stream flow or the reservoirs unless it's, excessive. And so what happened is our main reservoir in Idaho for water supply is the snowpack, and it typically provides water to irrigators all the way through or close to the end of June. And then we start to rely on our storage reservoir system after June in order to meet the agricultural demand. And so this year, with a really low snowpack, we had to dip into our reservoir system early on, especially in eastern Idaho. And so we had to rely on the man-made reservoir system rather than the snowpack. And so we're looking at really, really low carryover in the Snake, where it's only at 19% of capacity currently. Wow.
How early did you have to start pulling from the reservoirs this year?
Let me look at real quick.
Because you say
started pulling
usually it's June,
about
right?
Mid-April.
Holy
Mid-April. Because normally we don't start pulling from the reservoir until mid-June, early July. Last year it was a little warmer than normal, and we started pulling at the beginning of June. But when you start pulling mid-April, you start off low. So we only had 2.5 million acre feet in the reservoir because we had started drafting it early by the beginning of June. And so we're expecting very little carryover at the end of the season. We still have, another month and a half to go.
So
a little more than a month and a half.
So of course the reservoirs are a lot. They've been depleted more than normal because you had to pull from them earlier, and sometimes that water can carry over to the next year. What kind of a winter are you seeing we need in order to go back to the standard quote?
We would need a really wet winter, or perhaps a very, very wet spring. in order, or a really cool summer. There's some combinations that we could recover under. They're relatively rare. We're going to need more than just an average snowpack and average temperatures. An average snowpack will help kind of pull us along, but we're still, going to be right at that drought threshold, facing potential water shortages. Where we see the reservoir drawn down this low and then we have a second year of drought, those have always been our worst droughts on record. So 1992 was one of those years. 1988 was one of those years, 2001. So that's the potential type of drought, kind of a record-breaking drought that we could face next year if we have a low snowpack. If we have a normal snowpack, we can kind of limp along through another year.
That's really interesting. So with this current drought and the current levels of the reservoirs and the precipitation, the higher temperatures, what is the department? What's the department's project or goals to kind of, because you can't control what kind of snowpack we're going to get or how much precipitation we'll be able to hold. So with some of those uncertainties, what kind of goals or projects is the department working on to try to make sure worst case scenario next year isn't going to be as bad as projected?
Well, once you're into a drought, there's not a lot you can do to mitigate impacts. There's a few things. Of course, water conservation is always useful during a drought. Some water conservation can turn around and hurt, though, later on. If people are lining canals to try to improve it, the efficiency of delivery, the problem with that is the following year, if it's wet, those canals are our main source of recharge to the underlying aquifer, so the more efficient we get in surface water deliveries, the less water we have downstream. And we really saw that happen this year with the Swan Falls minimum stream flow. The Twin Falls Canal Company has been doing a lot of work to improve their irrigation efficiency. And so we're getting a lot less return from the Twin Falls Canal back to the Snake River, which then makes it more difficult for us to maintain that minimum stream flow down at Swan Falls. And if we go below the minimum stream flow, that results in the curtailment of what's known as the trust water rights. And we're expecting there's a very high probability we'll have to curtail the trust water rights next year.
And that's kind of getting into what I was already going to ask you a little later on is, so I want to talk about the water curtailments and the water rights, but I also want to talk about the current status of the aquifer. So you mentioned Twin Falls, how they're trying to make their irrigation more efficient, but then that also kind of, are you saying that depletes the recharging of the aquifer?
The amount of excess water from the canal system that returns back to the river, the more efficient they are, then they divert less at the top. They're able to get more to their patrons, and then they spill out less at the bottom. And so that means there's less water downstream. So one of the challenges with surface water efficiency improvements is that as you get more and more efficient upstream, there's less water downstream available for other users.
That makes sense.
And so it can hurt the people downstream.
That does make sense. So with that currently, what is the current status of the aquifer?
Well, this fall we'll go out and do some measurements to see where the aquifer is at the end of the irrigation season. We don't have that data yet, so I can't say anything definitive, but we're expecting to see the aquifer really, really low. It might be closing in on the lowest on record, but we'll have to go out, this fall and find out. If we hadn't been doing the aquifer recharge in the wet years, it would be much, much lower than it is today. And that's one of the things that is driving, the Twin Falls Canal Company for efficiency improvements, is that the base of their water supply is the discharge from the East Snake Plain Aquifer into the American Falls Reservoir. They have the senior priority to that water. And so as groundwater pumping has depleted the aquifer, improvements in irrigation efficiency upstream of Twin Falls have depleted the amount of recharge to the aquifer. Over time, that discharge has declined. And so they're basically required to improve their efficiency in order to meet the water demand of their users. And so, they're in a tough place. And so what we need is, some really good wet years where we can get in 1 million acre feet into the aquifer. And those groundwater cutbacks can, really, between the recharge and the groundwater cutbacks, if we have some good wet years, we can recover. But it's usually a 1 year delay between a wet year and when you see the aquifer recovery. So we're expecting the aquifer to continue to decline through this winter. So in that perspective, it's going to be a tougher year, for people relying on the aquifer discharge next year.
So with the current levels of the aquifer, and what are recharging efforts look like? What are some long-term sustainable goals that the department has to try to...
The department doesn't have set goals for recharge. The Idaho Water Resource Board, there's a slight difference. The Idaho Water Resource Board has a goal to recharge 350,000 acre feet. They can't do that. They can't even get close to that in dry years. So during the wet years, they have the capacity to put 1 million acre feet into the aquifer if that water is available. And so we need those wet years where they can maximize recharge into the aquifer. In the winter, they can get close to 200,000 acre feet if they don't allow any bypass past Milner. But there's just only so much water available in the winter, unless you're doing flood control operations.
Right. And is there, right now, is there enough surface water to continue to recharge the aquifer throughout the year? Do you know about that?
Yeah, there's plenty, because when we have a wet year, because we do flood control operations, and what happens with that during those flood control operations is the excess water just gets washed past Milner, and then on out of the state. And so we try to capture, the state's policy is to try to capture all of the excess water we can and get it into the aquifer. Now, we can't even come close to capturing all of that water in wet years. I think and don't quote me too tightly on this, but it's probably around 2 to 4 million acre feet in a really wet year that can bypass Milner. And if it comes at just the right rate, we can get 1 million acre feet into the aquifer. But we can have some pretty wet years and we're not able to quite get to 1 million acre feet because it can come really quick. And usually we get the best recharge after 1 year of flood control, when the second year comes in, because then they're able to start flood control earlier.
Okay.
And then we're able to maximize recharge. But there's no question, in years where the aquifer used to decline, we can now bring it up because we have that capacity for recharge. It's really changed the game. The 2014 and now the 2024 agreement between the groundwater pumpers and the surface water users has been a complete game changer in the trajectory of the ESPA.
That's really interesting that's been a huge help and benefit to the aquifer since then.
Yeah, it would be over 2 million acre feet less in the aquifer right now if it wasn't for the recharge and the groundwater cutbacks.
Wow. So I want to go back to a point you made earlier. So tension with water rights, it's kind of been a big hot button issue, especially for Eastern Idaho farmers. You said that you see definitely the way that things are going, there's a huge likelihood of additional curtailment orders. What choices are Eastern Idaho farmers facing with the current water situation and water curtailment?
The most important thing is for groundwater users to become part of a mitigation plan, because mitigation allows them to avoid curtailment in a drought year like this. And so the surface water users have agreed to allow them to divert out of priority if they're mitigating, with the hope that we have enough wet years we can recover the aquifer and maintain the ESPA in a stable condition. And so the senior surface water users through this agreement have allowed groundwater pumping out of priority in order to prevent curtailment of junior groundwater rights. And so that's the whole point of getting into a mitigation plan, is that it provides protection during years of drought, with the goal that during the wet years, we're able to take advantage of those years and recover the aquifer.
That's a lot of pressing issues are happening that are on the horizon with this current water situation. And David, yeah. I appreciate you coming on and talking to me about this, and for the listeners back at home to understand kind of the almost dire situation that we're in right now.
Yeah, with this strong El Nino coming on, there is a possibility southern Idaho gets a really wet winter. And it is possible we could see recovery this winter. We probably won't see much flood control even with a really strong snowpack, but we might have a little bit that could begin the aquifer recovery process. And then if it's followed by another decent year, then we could begin this aquifer recovery process. But right now, we got to wait and see what next year brings. Next year could be pretty rough, or it could be, a process that leads us toward recovery. But this is the challenge we face in a state with a limited water supply.
So it's we're playing the waiting game, the sitting game, and then if something comes, it's an uphill battle from there.
Yeah.
Well, David, I appreciate you coming on, talking to me more about this.
Yeah, happy to.
That was an interview with David Hokema, a hydrologist with the Idaho Department of Water Resources. We talked about the current water metrics in eastern Idaho, including the aquifer, reservoir levels, and possible water curtailments. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Weekdays on BYU-Idaho Radio. Savannah McCauley had this hour's music, and I had the interview. Join us tomorrow for another episode at noon and 6 p.m. I'm Harrison Kelly. Be informed, be inspired. BYU-Idaho Radio.